Since we learned about Bob Mueller's indictments, I discussed the potential consequences that may come to fruition as a result of all of the hysteria surrounding the announcement, like greater censorship and more warmongering. But Mueller's indictment announcement is now also being used to smear the left and ultimately discredit progressives like Bernie Sanders and Jill Stein. Now, it's really clever if you think about it, because if Bernie Sanders continues to poll as the most popular and trusted politician in the country, he'll most likely be able to steamroll any establishment Democrat the party tries to shove down our throats in 2020, even if they do rig parts of the primary process like they did last time. In fact, they rigged all of it last time. But here's what they're doing now. If they're able to use McCarthyism as a tactic to discredit Bernie since they can't compete with him on policy substance, this may actually be the establishment's go-to tactic in 2020 to maintain control of the party. In fact, mainstream media outlets are already trying to plant seeds about how Bernie Sanders may be a Russian puppet. For example, in Politico, we see the headline, "Sanders silent on claim that Russians backed him in 2016. And additionally, neoliberals on Twitter are beginning to circulate this article once again from June of 2017 in order to imply that Bernie Sanders may also be a Russian puppet since he voted against another round of Russian sanctions. Now, Bernie Sanders ultimately did end up denouncing Russian election meddling, but unfortunately for him, he ended up playing right into the Democratic Party's hand.
The real issue right now is how do we have a president of the United States not saying what everybody knows to be true? Russia interfered in 2016. They're going to interfere in 2018. And we have got to do everything we can to make sure that they do not undermine American democracy. Chuck, this is a huge deal. And that we don't have a president speaking out on this issue is a horror show. And we have got to bring Democrats and Republicans together, despite the president, to go forward to protect the integrity of American democracy.
All right. So there you see how Bernie Sanders condemned Russian election meddling, but unfortunately for him, he didn't specifically address how Russians tried to help his campaign. As MSNBC's Ari Melber puts it, Bernie Sanders' response to Mueller indictment does not address that this Russian operation tried to help his campaign per indictment. Just as I reported, re-Trump, that is a remarkable omission. And MSNBC's Joanne Reed responds, saying particularly since his voters were the target of what amounted to a foreign-run voter suppression campaign. The Russians' goal was to get his voters to stay home, write his name in, vote for Jill Stein, or basically do anything rather than vote for Clinton. Now, putting aside the fact that Joanne Reed recently said herself unequivocally that you can't trick people into voting for who they voted for, and also putting aside the fact that Russian troll accounts actually elevated Joanne Reed herself by retweeting her more times than they retweeted Bernie Sanders by a 5-to-1 ratio, the overall implication is that Bernie Sanders, one of the most popular and trusted politicians in the country, might not actually be as trustworthy as we all thought, because we know that the Russians tried to help his campaign, and conspicuously enough, he voted against sanctions. So maybe he's a Russian puppet. That's the implication here, and the smear campaign against Bernie Sanders wasn't just restricted to social media, because on MSNBC, this discussion took place.
Let me ask you this about the candidates who benefited, because much of this is new. It says now in here that Donald Trump was the main intended beneficiary and that Bernie Sanders was the other major party candidate who was a beneficiary. Neither of them have clearly stood up today and said, I don't want that help from the Russians. Please don't do that kind of thing for me. And anything that did happen, I disclaim. We hear a lot of criticism about the president, and he has a bigger job. But do you call on both Donald Trump and your colleague, Senator Sanders, to do that? Because neither has done so.
I would call on anyone who has anything to do with the Russian meddling in our elections to disavow it and disown it and denounce it.
When you say anyone, I just have to press you. It's part of my job. That includes Senator Sanders then as well.
It would include any of the candidates and any of the individuals who subsequently may be named as unindicted co-conspirators
And final
unwitting
question, sir.
cooperatives.
Now, that was Senator Richard Blumenthal, and even though his response was relatively vague, that MSNBC host got exactly what he wanted out of that discussion, because now you see the headline on MSNBC titled, "Dem Senator Calls Out Bernie Sanders to Disavow Russian Support." So do you see what they're doing? Do you see how they're using Mueller's announcement and McCarthyism to punch left and discredit Bernie Sanders? Not even Fox News stooped this low, but here you see the so-called liberal media outlets smearing Bernie Sanders as a Russian puppet, and they're now putting him in a position where he's forced to prove a negative and prove that he's not a Russian puppet, which is why Bernie Sanders himself is now going to learn the hard way that by pushing this anti-Russian hysteria that the Democratic Party is also pushing and using it against Trump, he played right into the Democratic Party establishment's hand, and it's now coming back to bite him in the ass because they're now using it against him. Good job, Bernie. And anyone who benefited from Russian trolling is now suspect. Anyone who's skeptical of Russiagate hysteria is now suspect. And I want to read to you the definition of McCarthyism. McCarthyism is the practice of making accusations of disloyalty, especially of pro-communist activity, in many instances unsupported by proof or based on slight, doubtful, or irrelevant evidence. This is what the Democratic Party establishment is resorting to in order to smear Bernie Sanders, and as you'll see here, he's not the only one, because once they're able to successfully discredit Bernie Sanders ahead of the 2020 election, they're going to make sure that every liberal in the country has nowhere else to turn to but the Democratic Party, because they're now also using the same tactic to discredit Green Party presidential candidate Dr. Jill Stein. Because if you can't trust the most trusted politician in the country, and you can't trust the Green Party certainly, then what do? Well, you have nowhere else to turn to but the Democratic Party. This is a hurting strategy that we're seeing. This is what we're seeing. It may not be a concerted effort. There may not be Democrats in this back room saying that this is the strategy that they want to use, but certainly this is what's happening. The correct response to Russians trying to elevate Bernie Sanders by posting buff Bernie memes, well, since that ad campaign cost the Russians a measly $8.56 and only got 761 clicks, Twitter user Blueberry Morning is calling on Bernie Sanders to give Russia their $8.56 back. That's the proper response. Humor. Because the idea that Russian trolls were able to influence the 2016 election by shitposting, by posting memes, it's a joke. So if you're concerned about election meddling, then you should definitely be speaking out against what the DNC did in 2016. They brazenly rigged the primary against Bernie Sanders. You should be speaking out against voter suppression tactics used by Republicans in states with large communities of marginalized minorities. You should be speaking out against gerrymandering. You should be calling for paper ballots. But all we see is hysteria.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.